There's a ritual among the Aethon Conclave. Before any uplift mission departs, before the ships are fueled, before the cultural integration teams are briefed, before the diplomatic translators are loaded, with whatever fragmentary language data the long-range observation probes have managed to collect, the mission commander stands before the Wall of Kindling. The Wall of Kindling is in the oldest building on the Conclave's home world, a structure so ancient that the stone itself has begun to forget the shape it was cut into. It is a long wall, floor to ceiling, edge to edge, carved with names, not names of heroes or admirals or great leaders, names of species. Every species the Aethon Conclave has ever found in the dark, every small flame of consciousness that was burning, cold and alone, somewhere in the vast nothing, when the Conclave reached out a hand and said, "You are not alone. Come with us. We will show you what you can become." There are 312 names on the Wall of Kindling. The ritual is simple. The mission commander stands before the wall and reads silently as many names as they can before their transport window closes. There is no required number. There is no audience. It is simply a reminder, intimate, private, weighty, of what the Conclave does and why. A reminder that every small species trembling on the edge of the wider galaxy was once a name on this wall. That every name was once a question mark. That the question was always answered the same way. What? We will uplift them. We will carry them forward. This is what we do. Mission Commander Asha-Vel had stood before the Wall of Kindling 41 times in her career. 41 missions. 41 species brought from isolation into the light of the Conclave's guidance. She was the most experienced uplift commander in living memory, possibly in all of Conclave history. She had uplifted species that communicated through magnetic fields, species that had no concept of permanent death, species that had never looked up at a night sky because their world had no moon and no gap in the cloud cover, and whose first sight of the wider cosmos had reduced their entire population to a kind of collective, reverent silence that lasted for 3 days. She had never failed an uplift. She stood before the Wall of Kindling for the 42nd time, read 17 names, and departed for a small blue world at the edge of a quiet spiral arm that her observation teams had been monitoring for 200 years. The briefing file said, pre-industrial civilization, transitional phase, high conflict frequency, notable creative output, recommend standard class 4A. Uplift. Protocol. Standard. Class 4 talk. Routine. She settled into her command chair as the fleet entered FTL. She did not know she would never stand before the Wall of Kindling again. Not because she would fail, but because after this mission, the very concept of the Wall, of the Conclave as the giver of light, and all others as the receivers, would feel, to her, like a beautiful lie she could no longer quite believe. The fleet dropped out of FTL at the system's outer boundary, as protocol required. 12 vessels, 3 science ships, 2 diplomatic carriers, 4 infrastructure support platforms, 2 medical vessels, and the command ship. The Eternal Steward, because the Aethon Conclave named things the way a parent names a child, with love and intent and a quiet confidence that they knew best. Asha-Vel stood at the observation deck and looked at the system laid out before her. The third planet, blue and white and achingly, absurdly beautiful, the way all inhabited worlds were from this distance, the way they always made her chest do. Something complicated when she first saw them. There was something about inhabited worlds seen from space, the particular quality of a biosphere that had been generating life for long enough to saturate everything with color, that never got routine, no matter how many times you saw it. She pulled up the observation file. The file was 200 years old at the opening, updated in real time by the long-range probes that the advanced survey team had seeded throughout the system. The early entries were standard fare. A species in the late pre-industrial phase, transitioning rapidly through several technological stages in a compressed time frame that the analysts had flagged as slightly unusual, but not unprecedented. High conflict activity, significant atmospheric modification, evidence of early space exploration, rudimentary orbital insertions, a few crewed missions to their nearest satellite, a handful of robotic probes flung into the outer system with more ambition than precision. Then the file jumped forward 80 years, as was standard for an observation gap. The probe network had experienced an intermittent data relay failure in that period, not uncommon, and the survey team hadn't prioritized repair since the species had been assessed as low urgency, and Asha-Vel began to read the updated entries. She stopped. She read the entry again. She called in her senior science officer. His name was Denvar, and he was the best xenological analyst in the fleet, which meant he was the best in the V. Conclave, which meant he was arguably the best in the known galaxy, a fact he wore with the quiet confidence of someone who has spent a long career being right. "Read this," she said. He read it. He read it again. "The probe relay was down for 80 years, he said. "Yes. And in those 80 years, yes. Why? That's not—" He stopped. He looked at the file. He scrolled forward. He scrolled back. "This isn't possible." And yet, Asha-Vel said, "The developmental curve." He shook his head. "A species at their stage of development in 80 years cannot—" "The numbers are confirmed?" she asked. "3 ended probe networks?" "Yes, confirmed." He put down the file and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Denvar, who had spent 40 years being the person with the answers, looked, for the first time in her experience, uncertain. Commander D. They didn't just accelerate. He searched for words. They collapsed the developmental curve. Stages that should take minimum 300 years, they went through them in 8. And they didn't just go through them. He trailed off again. "Finish the sentence, Denvar." "They solved things," he said. "Problems that we solved. Problems that every species in the Conclave went through the standard developmental stages to solve. Fusion power. Gravity manipulation. Unified field theory. They solved them. But Commander," he held up the file, "they solved them differently. Not the way we solved them. Not the way any species in our record solved them. The underlying physics is the same. It has to be. Physics is physics, but their approach, their frameworks, the way they got there." He shook his head slowly. "It's like they took a different path up the same mountain. A path I've never seen before." "Und, Asha-Vel looked at the blue world on her screen. "How long since the probe network came back online?" she asked. 18 months. "And the current status assessment?" Denvar was quiet for a moment. "That's the part," he said carefully, "that I wanted to talk to you about. They detected the message 4 hours after dropping out of FTL. This was not unusual in itself. Advanced species sometimes detected arrival signatures. The Conclave ships were large, and the FTL transition generated a distinctive gravimetric signature that a sufficiently sensitive monitoring network could detect within the inner system. The protocol in such cases was to proceed with standard introduction procedures, broadcast on the established contact frequencies, maintain a non-threatening approach vector, allow the detected species to initiate contact on their own terms. It usually took anywhere from 2 weeks to several months. The message came back in 4 hours. Not a panic military broadcast. Not a fearful warning. Not a religious response, which happened more often than the briefings admitted, particularly from species encountering FTL signatures for the first time. A simple, clean, mathematically structured signal. Contact protocols. Standard galactic format. The format that the Conclave used, that every species in the Conclave used, that had been established as the universal first contact language approximately 12,000 years ago. The humans were broadcasting in contact protocol language. Denvar stared at his console for a long time. They shouldn't know this format, he said. No, Asha-Vel agreed. The format is, this is internal Conclave communication protocol. We don't broadcast it. There's no way they could have. They reverse engineered it, said Lynn, the communications analyst from her station. Her voice had a quality Asha-Vel had not heard from her before. Not quite all, but adjacent to it. Look at the signal structure. They didn't receive this from us. They derived it. They worked backward from our probe network communication signals and reverse engineered the underlying protocol architecture. She looked up from her console. In 18 months, all had been assessed. I will see. The bridge was very quiet. Play the message, Asha-Vel said. The message was in 3 parts. The first part was a greeting in the contact protocol language, formal, correct, precisely structured, with none of the small errors that newly discovered species always made when working with an unfamiliar framework. No errors at all. The second part was a set of coordinates, a location in the planet's mid-orbital range, and at a time, approximately 32 hours from the current moment. The third part was 5 words in the contact protocol language that Asha-Vel would spend the rest of her life thinking about. We have been expecting you. They went to the coordinates. Asha-Vel brought the Eternal Steward and 1 science vessel. She left the rest of the fleet at the system boundary for the cultural integration teams, the infrastructure platforms, the medical vessels, all the machinery of an uplift mission, all the careful apparatus of a civilization preparing to take a lesser species by the hand. She left them behind because she had looked at Denvar's face when he read the updated assessment, and she understood that arriving with a whack, the full fleet would be the wrong opening move. She didn't fully know why she understood this. She had been on 41 missions. She had a playbook. The playbook said, bring the full fleet, demonstrate capability, establish the benevolent authority of the Conclave from the opening moment. The playbook had worked 41 times. She left the fleet at the boundary and went with 2 ships. At the coordinates, they found a station. Not a large station by Conclave standards. Elegant, actually. Modest and precise in the way of something built to do a specific job rather than to impress. It was in perfect orbital alignment, positioned to be visible from the planet's surface with the naked eye on a clear night, which Asha-Vel suspected was deliberate. It had a single docking port, sized. She checked the measurements and felt something shift quietly in her chest for a ship approximately the size of the Eternal Steward. They had built the station for this meeting. They had known the meeting was coming. A hailing signal came from the station as they approached. Denvar answered it because his translator suite was the most sophisticated on the ship. The response came in the Conclave's own primary diplomatic language, not the contact protocol, but the actual language, the one spoken aboard every Conclave vessel. And in every Conclave hall of government, the one that took most newly encountered species a minimum of 2 years to achieve basic functional comprehension of. The response was fluent, completely fluent, with the kind of idiomatic ease that came not from translation software, but from genuine deep familiarity. Denvar took off his headset, set it carefully on the console, and did not say anything for a moment. How? Asha-Vel asked. The probe network, he said. 18 months of intercepted internal communications. They didn't just learn the protocol. They learned. He stopped. Commander, they learned the language, yes. But also, they learned how we think. the way we structure arguments, the way we express uncertainty versus confidence, widens, the way we signal respect and status and discomfort. He looked at her. In 18 months from probe intercepts, they built a comprehensive model of Athon conclave communication and cognition. Asha-Vel thought about that. She thought about it for a long time. Then she straightened her uniform, told Denvar to prepare a shuttle, and went to meet whoever was on the other side of that docking port. There were 3 of them. They stood in the docking bay of their station, with the easy posture of people in a place they owned, which they were, and with expressions that Asha-Vel could not entirely read, which was unusual. Human expressions were, the briefing had noted, exceptionally readable by most species, features that had likely contributed to their rapid social development. She could read warmth in them, curiosity, something that in a conclave diplomat she would have called professional assessment. She could not read deference. This was the first mission in 41, where the species she had come to uplift had not looked at her with any form of deference. The one in the center stepped forward and spoke in the conclave's language and said, "Commander Asha-Vel, we've read a great deal about you. Your uplift record is extraordinary." A pause. "We have some questions about the Veth-Sar mission. The third one. We think there may have been a better approach for their third phase cultural integration, and we'd be interested in your perspective." Now in phase. Asha-Vel had conducted the Veth-Sar third phase integration 23 years ago. It was not her finest work. She had made a judgment call that she still second-guessed, a compromise between speed and thoroughness that had left some cultural tension in the Veth-Sar society that took a decade to fully resolve. She had written about it in her mission debrief, in the kind of careful technical language that mission debriefs use. She had shared her reservations with her team. She had not, to her knowledge, discussed it with anyone outside the conclave. "The debrief," she said. "You accessed? The probe network also captured some of your internal communications during the approach," the human said pleasantly. "We weren't intentionally eavesdropping. We were learning the language, and the signal happened to include your preliminary mission discussions. We can discuss what we accessed if that would make you more comfortable." Another pause, and the expression shifted, still warm, but with something precise behind it. "Or we can simply proceed. We have a great deal to talk about." Well, what a day. Asha-Vel spent 6 days on the station. Denvar spent them 2, and by the 3rd day he had stopped taking notes because the notes had become inadequate. He was no longer documenting anomalies. He was living inside one, and the anomaly was too large and too consistent and too astonishing to be captured in a document that had been designed for a different kind of encounter entirely. On the first day, they toured the station. It was a research facility. Multiple divisions, each dedicated to a different field of inquiry, each operating at a level that Denvar kept having to recalibrate his reference points to properly assess. Not because the humans had the most advanced technology he had ever seen. They didn't, not across the board, but because the technology they had developed was in some areas simply different from the conclaves. Not better or worse. Different paths up the same mountain, as he had said on the bridge, and some of those paths turned out to reach vantage points that the conclave's path had missed entirely. The unified field framework they were using in the station's drive system was not the conclave's framework. It was an independent derivation that arrived at the same fundamental physics, but through a completely distinct mathematical architecture. And when Denvar spent several hours with the lead engineer reviewing the underlying equations he found buried in the mathematical structure, a generalization that the Conclave's framework had been unable to produce. Generalization that resolved an inconsistency that Conclave physicists had been arguing about for 600 years. He sat with that for a long time after the meeting. On the second day, they discussed history, specifically the human's history. Specifically, what had happened in the 80 years the probe relay was down. Asha-Vel had expected complexity. She had not expected what she found, which was not complexity exactly, but wait. The 80 years were not a simple upward curve of technological development. They were something more difficult than that, something that the briefing file's dry developmental metrics had entirely failed to capture. A civilization that had looked at itself clearly, found what it was, decided what it wanted to be, and undergone a transformation so total and so deliberate that calling it development felt insufficient. They had not just solved fusion and gravity and unified field theory. They had solved, or were in the process of solving, in the messy, non-linear way that actual solutions always worked, the older, harder problems. Conflict, distribution, the relationship between individual and collective, the management of fear. They had not solved them perfectly. They were human, which meant they were argumentative and complicated and perpetually unsatisfied with any answer that had been given before. But they had made progress that the Conclave standard models said should have taken 3 times as long. How? Asha-Vel asked. On the second day, the human she was speaking with, the one from the docking bay, whose name she now knew and who had the particular quality of presence that she associated with Wes. People who had spent a long time thinking about very large things considered the question. Urgency, he said. We had some significant problems with finite timescales. Climate, resources, things that couldn't wait for the standard rate of progress. He paused. Necessity focused us, and we're very good, as a species, at focusing when we have to. Other species have faced urgency, Asha-Vel said. Other species faced urgency alone, he said. We faced ours having read every book ever written about how other humans had faced impossible problems before. We had 10,000 years of accumulated failure and success to learn from. We made mistakes. We made different mistakes than the ones before us. Eventually, the mistakes got smaller. He looked at her. It's not magic. It's just iteration at very high speed by a species that writes everything down and can't stop arguing. Nuts and decoil. Asha-Vel smiled, because she couldn't help it. On the third day, she asked about their space program. She had looked at the numbers in Denvar's updated file. She had not yet asked what she needed to ask, because she recognized privately, hesitant. The mission commander, who had never failed an uplift, hesitant to ask a question because she was not certain she wanted the answer. She asked it. How far have you gone? He told her. She made him show her the data. She verified it independently that evening with Denvar. Denvar confirmed it. She sat in her quarters on the Eternal Steward for a long time, looking at the numbers. The Conclave had probes, currently active, in various parts of the galaxy. Deep-range explorers moving slowly through the dark, sending back data over a decades-long transmission window. She knew where all of them were. She checked the coordinates. 3 of her probes had data anomalies in their transmission records over the past 40 years. Small things. Things she had noted and filed and not followed up on because they weren't significant enough to prioritize. She now understood what had caused the anomalies. They've been to the probe locations, Denvar said, appearing in her doorway. He had reached the same conclusion. Not just the inner system, the deep range probes. They've been there. Commander, they've been operating in deep space, undetected, for at least 40 years. Base, bad, Belleroom. Asha-Vel looked at her mission brief. Standard Class 4, Uplift Protocol. She thought about the Wall of Kindling. 312 names. 312 small flames found in the dark, guided gently into the light. She thought about arriving here with 12 ships, full of cultural integration teams and infrastructure platforms and medical vessels. She thought about the phrase, "We have been expecting you." She thought about a civilization that had apparently decided 60 years ago that they would be ready when the visitors finally arrived. That had observed, analyzed, learned, developed, and prepared with such quiet thoroughness that the most experienced Uplift mission commander in the Conclave had been on station. For 3 days before she began to properly understand that she had not, in any meaningful sense, come here to uplift anyone. They had simply been waiting until humanity decided it was time to say hello. On the 6th day, she had the conversation she had been working toward since the docking bay. They were in the station's observation deck, a long curved room with a full panoramic view of the planet below and the starfield beyond. The 3 humans who had met her at the dock were all there. She had come to understand, over 6 days, that they were not exactly diplomats or scientists or administrators, though they were all of those things. They were something slightly different. Representatives, perhaps in the fullest sense, people who carried in them the whole weight and color of what their civilization had become, and who had been chosen specifically because they understood that weight and could speak for it. Honestly, I want to ask you something directly, Asha-Vel said. Please, said the one from the docking bay. The Conclave has 312 species in its membership. We have been finding and uplifting civilizations for 12,000 years. In all of that time, she paused. In all of that time, we have always been the ones who came. We have always been the older, the more advanced, the ones with the hand extended. Nani cares. The humans listened. Why? We came here to uplift you, she said. This was the mission. This was the protocol. And I understand now that the premise was. She stopped, because the word she wanted was one that her language used primarily for errors of scale. For when you had badly misjudged the size of something. Optimistic? One of the humans offered gently. She laughed because she couldn't help it, and because the laughter had some grief in it. Optimistic, she said. Yes. What I want to ask is, what do you want? Not what you've prepared, or what you're ready for, or what the protocols require. What do you actually want from this, from us, from the Conclave? The 3 humans looked at each other, not checking, the way junior officials checked with their seniors before speaking. Just sharing something, a look that had the quality of a long-settled understanding. The one from the docking bay spoke. We want to be useful, he said. Not uplifted, not guided. We've been doing our own guiding for a while now, and we've gotten reasonably good at it. But, what? He leaned forward slightly, and she saw in him, for the first time, something that looked like genuine enthusiasm. You've been doing this for 12,000 years. 312 species. You've made mistakes, and learned from them, and built something that is, whatever its limitations, genuinely extraordinary. And we, he gestured, a wide-open gesture that seemed to take in the planet below, and the stars beyond it, and everything that had happened. The 80 years the probes were down. We have been sitting here with a very large collection of new ideas, and no one to argue with about them. We would like to argue with someone who has 12,000 years of context. Marne. Asha-Vel looked at him. You want to join the Conclave, she said. We want to help build what comes after the Conclave, he said. Simply, without arrogance. As a fact, Medidi, we have great respect for what you've built. We have some thoughts about where it could go next. We think those conversations would benefit everyone. Nyat, Inoi. The observation deck was quiet. The planet turned slowly below them, blue and white and ancient. Asha-Vel thought about the Wall of Kindling. 312 names. And she thought about how the wall was structured, how it only recorded the name of species the Conclave had found, how it had never occurred to anyone in 12,000 years of uplifting civilizations that a name might one day need to be added that had found them first. She would suggest on her return that the wall be expanded. She would suggest that the new section be called something different. Not the Wall of Kindling. Perhaps the Wall of Equals. I think, she said slowly, looking at the planet and at the humans and at the stars beyond, that this is going to require a longer conversation. We have time, he said. And tea, said one of the others. The one who had been quiet the longest, who had a quality of watchfulness that Asha-Vel had associated over 6 days with wrens. The deepest kind of thinker, the ones who were always 3 steps ahead and chose their words accordingly. We've been studying Conclave dietary data for 6 months. We're reasonably confident we've developed something you'll enjoy. Me? Well, the tea, when it arrived, was extraordinary. Of course it was. Mission Commander Asha-Vel submitted her mission report 6 weeks later, after returning to Conclave state. It was the longest report she had ever written. It was also the most honest, because at 41 missions in 29 years, she was past the age of softening things to fit the framework that received them. The report ran to 600 pages. The summary was 4 sentences. The subject species does not require uplift. The subject species has, through independent development, reached a technological and civilizational stage, comparable in most areas and superior in some to current Conclave benchmarks. The subject species is aware of the Conclave's history, methodology, and internal discussions to an extent that should prompt a comprehensive review of our probe network security protocol. I recommend immediate reclassification from Uplift, candidate to peer contact, and I recommend that this reclassification be accompanied by genuine humility, because they are going to have opinions about everything we do, and those opinions are going to be correct more often than we would prefer. The Council received the report with what Asha-Vel could only describe as dignified confusion, the particular expression of a body that had been operating on a 12,000-year-old assumption and was now being asked to update it. They updated it. It took 3 years of negotiation and 7 rounds of what the human delegation called productive disagreement, and the Conclave senior diplomats called the most exhausting and illuminating experience of my career. At the end of those 3 years, humanity joined the Conclave, not as a new member guided by established wisdom, but as a co-signatory to a revised charter that contained, in its preamble, a line that had never appeared in any Conclave document before. No civilization, however ancient, holds a monopoly on becoming. Asha-Vel read that line when the charter was published. She thought about the Wall of Kindling, about the 312 names, about standing before it 42 times and reading as many as she could, feeling the weight of all those small found flame. She thought about the blue world at the edge of the quiet spiral arm, and the station that had been waiting for her, and the tea, and the 6 days, and the 4 sentences in her report. She thought about a civilization that had decided, quietly and without announcement, to become whatever it needed to become. That had done so not in response to any outside hand or guiding light, but simply because that was what it did. Because it was human, and humans had always, in the end, looked at what they were, and decided to be more. She stood before the Wall of Kindling one last time. She did not read any names. She just stood there and looked at the wall, the whole long, ancient, beloved wall. And she felt, for the first time in 29 years, that she was beginning to understand something that the wall, for all its 312 names, had never quite taught her. The flame was never small. She had simply been standing too far away to see how large it already was.